I honestly don't know why I keep telling people what happened to Zach's family. It's not like you'll believe me, and every time I talk about it, I feel like it takes something from me. Each time I recall that night, it chips away at my sanity, and frankly, I don't think I can afford to lose much more. That night, I still have nightmares about it every time I close my eyes. Well, I've decided this is the last time I'm going to talk about it, and then hope to God I can somehow forget it. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to finally listen to me. This all started with a death in the family. My grandpa passed away and I came home to attend the funeral. It was a strange affair that left me feeling a bit sad. Grandpa was a private guy and never really had a lot to say, and when he did say something, it was often a bit too honest. I'd always suspected a lifetime of experience made him feel entitled to give his unfiltered opinion. I never personally minded it. In fact, I thought it was refreshing to hear what someone actually thought, not hidden behind a mask of social norms or fake politeness. Well, most people didn't see it that way. In fact, most of the family thought he was a miserable old man and said as much on a few occasions. At least half of my family didn't bother to show up to the funeral, and the other half stood around awkwardly, clearly unsure or unwilling to speak about him. The one positive thing to come out of it was that my old high school buddy Zach showed up to pay his respects. He owned the only hardware shop in town that his dad had left him. He also happened to be one of the few people who still spoke regularly to my grandpa. I guess Grandpa always had some kind of project going on at his cabin and single-handedly helped keep the shop profitable during the lean times. We exchanged phone numbers and promised to catch up soon. I remember him saying, "It's time to get the Jack and Zach team back together," with a laugh and a corny thumbs up. I decided I was going to take him up on that offer. Other than work, I really didn't talk to anyone, and the only team of my life had been the Jack and Jack gang. And Jack Daniels makes for a terrible friend in the long haul. The funeral was a quick affair and couldn't have lasted more than an hour. The small crowd disappeared back to the parking lot, feeling that they had fulfilled the bare minimum of obligations required. Just as I was about to hop into my car and do the same, my dad waved me down, walking quickly in front of the vehicle. He explained to me that Grandpa left his cabin to him and he had no use for it. My dad wasn't much of a hunter and didn't care for the outdoors, but he knew I loved hiking and camping, plus the cabin had been in the family for 3 generations. He didn't feel right about selling it. Said I could have it as long as I moved back to town and didn't try to sell the thing myself. At the time, it sounded like a much better offer than anything going on in my 1-bedroom apartment with the leaky water heater. Plus, my job sucked and they barely paid me enough to live, let alone thrive. So I did what any one of us would have done in that situation. I agreed and took the cabin keys. I figured if I wasn't paying rent, I could at least find a halfway decent job and start saving money. So I headed home, packed the things I cared about, and left the rest. On the way out of the city, I turned in my name badge and let the manager know that he could proceed to fornicate with himself. I bought a cheap bottle of vodka that tasted like battery acid and proceeded to head to the cabin. By the time I'd arrived on the property, it was night, and I'd forgotten how much land my grandpa owned. It was miles of forest with a small cabin in the center. At first, the road was smooth and easy to navigate. But as I got closer to the cabin, the quality dropped off dramatically. The once clean, black asphalt was now a gray gravel path with lots of potholes that caused me to bounce around uncomfortably. The gravel road was hard to navigate. The limbs of the trees scraped against the hood of my car, creating a shrill sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The headlights of the car caused the shadows to dance around in the forest. It made the low-hanging branches look like hands trying to grab my small vehicle and pull it away. I can't be certain what I actually saw, but a bit of movement just beyond the light of the car caused me to slam on my brakes. At the time, I assumed it was an animal. I still believed the world made sense then, but deep down I knew it was far too tall for a deer or coyote. It had the outline of something that shouldn't be in the woods. For a split second, I could swear it looked like something that walked on two legs. However, I chose to ignore that gut feeling. Why, I can't really tell you. Maybe I felt like I didn't need to come up with a reason to look this gift horse in the mouth. Or maybe I just really needed this to work out since I had quit my job. Whatever the case, I pushed away the uneasy feeling and continued down the gravel path. Arriving at the front of the cabin was disappointing to say the least. The last time I had visited this place, I was a young teen. Now, as a grown man, some of the magic had disappeared. The structure was a dark brown, with a red door that looked unnatural in the forest. The paint was starting to peel off in small chunks at the bottom of the entrance, leaving crimson chips on the doormat. I dug the key out of my pocket and opened the door. Immediately, the smell of my grandpa hit me at the doorway, and with it a flood of memories. The fishing trips, hiking the trails, riding on the four-wheeler with him. It filled me with a mix of happiness and sadness. Happy to have experienced those moments, but sad to know that those trails could never truly be traveled again. I guess we can never appreciate what is good in the moment. Only in retrospect do we understand the value of those experiences. I suppose you never know that you're living in the good times, right? I remember the cold wind pushed me out of the haze and forced me to go inside. It took a bit to recall how to use a wood stove, but I eventually got the old cabin warmed up and started poking around the place. The cabin was full of books. My grandpa was a big reader and often preached that the foundation of civilization was made of literacy. He had been a fan of the classics. However, on his desk were a few books that seemed odd choices for him. One was called Hunt for the Skinwalker, and the other one I remember finding was Missing 411, I think, or some strange title like that at least. But what really made it odd was that it was about the paranormal, and my grandpa had often gone off on anyone who would talk about such things, saying that it was pure foolishness. At the time, I had guessed that maybe he found it entertaining and left it at that. On the bed, I found a notebook with a pen shoved into the spiral rings. Flipping through a few pages, it appeared to be a hunting journal. I moved it over to the coffee table and figured I'd give it a read later. That night, all I wanted to do was take a few swigs of the rot gut vodka I'd bought and try to get some rest before starting my job hunt in the morning. The next day, I was slow to get up. I suspected the vodka played a big role in the delay. But I knew the meager amount of money in my bank account was not going to last long, even if I wasn't going to be paying rent. I needed to start the job hunt. However, knowing what you need to do and doing it are two different things. Instead, I started out my day exploring the woods that I would now be calling home. I don't think I was looking for anything in particular, just looking for a temporary escape. The trails were pretty much how I remembered them from my childhood. It was as if the land was timeless, never changing or bending to the demands of modern society. However, there was one bit of modern tech hanging around a few of the trees. At some point, my grandpa had decided to hang trail cams around his property, which was surprising to find since he disdained anything that could be considered modern. Although each one I found had one property in common. They had all been smashed with some sort of blunt object. Maybe they didn't belong to my grandpa after all, but if it was a trespasser putting them up, wouldn't it be just as easy to take them down? Plus, some of them looked pretty expensive. Either way, if someone was taking the time to break them instead of taking them, it was meant to send a message. I just didn't understand the meaning of the message yet. After wasting a couple hours, I finally jumped into my car and headed into town. As I suspected, the career prospects of a place with a population just over 3,000 people are limited at best. EJ's Grill offered to pay me $50 under the table each week to wash dishes, which I almost took before they said it would be 20 hours a week. Doing some quick math in my head, this meant I was making $2.50 an hour. So I got out of that place in a hurry and decided to never eat at EJ's again. I tried a couple of gas stations and a grocery store, but they dismissed me pretty quickly. At least the grocery store let me fill out an application and said they'd call me if anything came up. But I got the feeling this was an attempt to placate me more than to actually give me a shot. In my car, I started scrolling through my phone and remembered talking to Zach at the funeral. With little option left, I gave him a call and told him about my situation. He was excited to hear I was going to be back in town and said he had just the opportunity for me. Now that he had a little one running around the house, he really wanted more time with the family, meaning he needed someone he could trust to close the hardware store at night. It would only be 3 to 4 hours of work, 5 days a week, and he said he could pay me $15 an hour. It was by far the best deal I'd been offered, so I jumped at it, although I suspect he really was just trying to help me out more than he actually needed the help. Getting to go home early, I suppose, was just a nice bonus for him. Feeling accomplished, I went back to the cabin, and best of all, when I got back, the sun was still up. That meant I could spend more time scouting the land I had just inherited. I found the keys to the four-wheeler and decided that'd be the best way to cover more ground. However, when I turned the key, the only sound that came from it was a dull click. Completely dead. Didn't even turn over. So I was back on foot, which was honestly fine by me. Walking was comforting in its own way. Rather than go down the paths I knew, this time I decided to take a trail I didn't remember seeing as a kid. This one was certainly less worn. I thought at the time that it must have been a path my grandpa was making before he passed away. The property was so large, I'm sure there were areas he had yet to explore. I was still excited by the prospect of mystery in those days. After following the path for a good 30 minutes, I arrived at a stone formation I was not familiar with. No trees grew next to the rocks. The stones were all at least 6 to 7 feet tall and looked like they had been dropped from the sky and stuck into the ground like arrows. Thinking back on it, I can't be certain it was natural or man-made. I'm not a geologist or anything, but I couldn't help but shake the feeling that they had been placed with a purpose. Walking around the stone towers, I found one that looked a little different from the others. The color was slightly darker and it was a bit taller. In a trance, I walked towards it, as if the odd stone was drawing me in, demanding that I pay homage to it. However, when my foot failed to find the ground, I snapped out of it and managed to pull myself back. Pulling back suddenly caused me to tumble onto the ground in a less than graceful manner. In front of the dark-colored stone was a hole in the ground at least 4 feet in circumference. Getting up off the ground, I leaned over the hole and immediately felt the cold, damp air come out of it. Pulling out my phone, I turned on the flashlight to see it was in fact an entrance to a cavern. I had no idea the property had a cave on it, which I found extremely exciting. The one issue was that it was at least 10 feet down to the bottom of it. If I wanted to go into it, I'd need some kind of climbing gear. I wanted to stay longer, but the setting sun forced me to retreat from the stone formation and away from the newly discovered cave. Although I was comfortable in the woods, I didn't think it was wise to wander around them at night. Plus, the unsettling image of the tall thing I thought I saw the night before still prodded my mind. I got back to the cabin right as the sun completely disappeared from the sky. I spent a good bit of time pacing back and forth in the cabin, thinking about the best way to get into the cave. I ultimately decided that I was going to need some help if I wanted to see what was inside. And I really only had one friend in this town that I could ask to take part in something that was quite honestly a bit reckless. I had decided that I would talk to Zach about it tomorrow afternoon at the hardware store. My attention ended up gravitating towards the coffee table and the notebook my grandpa had been using as a hunting journal. I decided to flip through the pages and see if he had ever found the cave. Most of the entries were pretty boring stuff, but the last page caused a cold chill to run down my spine. That one short sentence will haunt me for the rest of my days. The last entry of the notebook said, "The man with no face wakes up at night." After reading that line, I closed the notebook and locked the door for good measure. I then spent a good part of the night debating the meaning of that one sentence. I decided it must have been my grandpa's attempt at creative writing, or a manifestation of mental illness he had managed to keep hidden from us. But I knew for a fact that my grandpa wasn't much of a writer, and he wasn't crazy in the sense of being out of touch with reality. I attempted to put it out of my mind and went to bed. But my dreams that night had been filled with shadows moving in the dark, impossibly tall creatures standing over my bed, waiting for me to close my eyes and move in for the kill. Just as they were about to lunge at me, I would wake up alone in the dark cabin, then wait for sleep to slowly find me, just so the whole process could start over again. I woke up the next morning feeling like a zombie. I loaded up with an entire pot of coffee and sat on the porch watching the morning pass into the afternoon. Finally, the large dose of caffeine was enough to get me awake and ready to start my shift at the hardware store. I drove into town and parked in the empty lot outside the shop. As soon as I entered, I was greeted by Zach, who was eager to have me start. He showed me how to run the register, how inventory worked, and what needed to be done to close at the end of day. My first day happened to be a slow day, so it gave us plenty of time to talk. And of course, the conversation naturally led to my most recent discovery, the secret cave on the property. As soon as I described it, I could tell Zach was hooked. He was ready for some kind of adventure, something to break the monotony. Hell, I wanted the escape as well. We ended up getting so worked up by it that he decided to close early, grabbed his climbing gear from the house, and drove straight to my cabin. He followed me in his truck to the property, his vehicle having a far easier time with the uneven terrain. Once we arrived at the cabin, we parked quickly and headed down to the stone monolith in the cave. We laughed and joked about the things we could find: buried treasure, Civil War relics. We couldn't have possibly guessed what we would actually find that day. We both wanted to be the first to go into the cave. I argued that I discovered it, therefore the right was mine. Zach said he had the rappelling gear and that I didn't even know how to use it. We ultimately settled on a coin toss, which resulted in Zach being the winner, thus the first person to go into the cave. He put on his harness, tied off the rope to a nearby rock tower, and proceeded to rappel down into the narrow hole. I pointed a flashlight into the cave as he descended, trying my best to help light the way. Once he reached the bottom, he pulled out a small light from his pocket and started looking around. He pointed to the left and looked up with a dumb grin on his face. He yelled to me that the cave opened up and he was going to go check it out. Then he would come back so that I could come down and see. I saw him disappear from sight, leaving me looking down at the cavern floor. I heard his footsteps echo through the tunnel, starting out slow at first, then speeding up. After a brief pause, I heard my friend begin to yell from the tunnel below. It caught me by surprise and I ended up dropping my flashlight. It smashed into the stone floor, killing the only source of light I had with me. I started yelling for Zach because I didn't know what else to do. Then a silence fell over the cave that filled me with dread. I want to tell you that I was brave and went down into the hole to find my friend. However, without a light, without knowing what was happening, I hesitated. I waited at the entrance for 5 or 10 minutes, calling his name. Then I felt him pulling on the rope, trying to get up. I reached out my hand into the dark to try to find him. His iron grip grabbed my arm, sending a wave of pain coursing through my body. But I fought through the pain and grabbed his hand with my other arm and pulled him up. He seemed confused, almost like he didn't understand what I was doing. But the part that was odd is how calm he was about the whole thing. I tried to ask him what the hell happened, why was he screaming? But he politely refused to answer my questions. Just said he had to go home. He had to see his family. Left the climbing gear and everything. just walked off into the woods. I sat next to the cave entrance for a couple of minutes, catching my breath. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't understand what was wrong. It was like a splinter stuck in my mind. I couldn't see the issue, but I could feel it stabbing at me, trying to let me know that it was there. It needed to be discovered. I walked back slowly to the cabin, replaying the event in my head over and over. It still didn't make any sense. I got back to the cabin and saw that Zach's truck was gone. With nothing else left to do, I grabbed my phone out of the car and retreated back to the cabin. I tried to watch some movies to get my mind off the cave, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't forget it. Zach's scream had real fear in it, yet he seemed perfectly fine when he got back out, like nothing had happened. Then I started thinking about how he climbed up. He wasn't wearing the harness when he came out. Did he just climb the rope even though he had access to the climbing gear? Why would he take off the harness? I looked at my grandpa's notebook on the coffee table, and a sudden thought managed to push to the surface. The puzzle piece that I was missing was suddenly revealed. I called up my dad and asked him one question I had never thought to ask. I had assumed that I knew the answer. I asked Dad how Grandpa died. His answer confirmed my darkest fears. He didn't die of natural causes. Apparently, he had fallen off a bluff in the middle of the woods. It took days for Dad to find the body when Grandpa stopped answering his phone. He didn't want to give me the details, but I finally got him to admit that an animal had started eating at his corpse. That was why it was a closed casket. When I got off the phone, I grabbed the extra flashlight off the nightstand and ran back into the woods. The sun was quickly retreating, but I didn't care. I needed an answer now, and come hell or high water, I was going into that cave. I had to see what exactly was in that cave. Getting back to the stone monoliths, I saw the rope was still in place. I did my best to climb it, but I wasn't wearing gloves, and it's actually really hard to climb down a rope. Halfway down, I slid faster than I meant to and ended up burning my hands and legs. The pain was certainly present, but I don't remember it bothering me. Almost like it was an out-of-body experience or something. Anyways, I pointed my flashlight to the left and saw the large opening that went deeper into the cave. Each step into the tunnel required me to push down my fear, to remember that I needed an answer to what was actually going on. That splinter that needed to be pulled out couldn't be left any longer. The pace of my heart was thunderous. Each few steps into the tunnel revealed a new gruesome story. Claw marks on the stone walls, dried brown blood painting each turn, and skeletal remains of animals that had been caught by whatever was living in this place. Finally, my flashlight spotted something that seemed out of place. It almost looked like a folded up red carpet. It took a few seconds for my brain to understand what I was seeing. Finally, I realized what I was seeing, and it caused me to turn and run in terror. It was Zach that was laying in a bloody pile on the cavern floor. His clothes had been stripped off of him, and a permanent look of terror was carved into his lifeless face. The adrenaline allowed me to climb up the rope with ease. The pain from my burned hands didn't even register. The only thing that mattered was escaping, getting away from what I had just seen. Once I was out, I walked a few paces and collapsed against a tree. An uncomfortable sob filled my throat and sputtered out of my mouth. Seeing the corpse of one of my friends was almost more than I could bear at the moment, but just as quickly as the sobbing started, it had left me, taken instead by the realization that needed time to take root, the realization being the puzzle piece that was out of place. If Zach's body was in the cave, who or what crawled out of it and went to his house? The next thing I knew, I was sprinting back to the cabin. My legs and lungs burned from the exertion, but I couldn't afford to slow down. I was certain something terrible was about to happen at Zach's house. The only question that echoed in my head was if I was going to make it in time. I jumped into my car and took off down the road. The frame of my old vehicle bounced off the uneven terrain numerous times, but I knew I couldn't afford to take it slow. By some miracle, I managed to hit the smooth asphalt road, with the car still mechanically functional despite my reckless driving. I must have gone at least 65 miles per hour through the town. I was lucky that pretty much all the traffic stopped at 9 p.m. Once I arrived at Zach's house, the pace of my heart skyrocketed as the headlights hit the house. Zach's truck was parked in front, and the door was left wide open. Not a single light was on in the house, so I pulled up to allow my headlights to line up with the door. I jumped out and walked up to the entrance. I'd been in such a rush, I realized that I lacked any kind of plan. Now that I was here, I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was dealing with or how to handle it. Hell, who would? It's not like they give out manuals for this kind of stuff. Part of me was wondering if I had lost my mind and I was just making this up. But Zach's body was definitely in that cave, and something came to his house. That part I was certain about. Against my better judgment, I ultimately stepped into the house after hesitating for a couple of minutes. Each footstep echoed through the quiet hall, as if I had walked into a museum or a tomb. In the living room, I saw Zach standing in the corner, with this strange grin painted on his face. Not a happy smile. No, it was one of malicious victory. And at his feet were the bodies. The blood had been flowing for so long that it had begun to dry in some spots on the hardwood floor. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I knew it was the truth. I could no longer pretend I was going crazy. Reality had been clarified for me, and my darkest fears confirmed. Zach and his family were gone, and some unknown horror stood in front of me, wearing my friend's face. The thing pretending to be Zach took a couple of steps towards me, and I instinctively began to back up. It continued to advance, and I retreated until we arrived at the entrance of the house. I wish I was brave, that I had confronted the murderer of my friend, but instead I froze in place when my back slammed against the wall. The thing walked up to me and put its hand on my shoulder, like we were old pals or something. But the grip was strong, bordering on painful, like a predator making sure its prey was trapped. Then it spoke, but it wasn't Zach's voice. It said, "Fear not, I haven't come for you. That day will come later." And with those words, it released me and went out the door. Once I regained my composure, I managed to call the police. I knew I had to tell someone what was happening. I walked out into the yard to see if the creature was still around. However, it had vanished into the night. It didn't even bother to take Zach's truck. My guess now is that it didn't need it to travel. The county sheriff, along with everyone in town, showed up at Zach's house. They asked me a multitude of questions that I did my best to answer, but I made one mistake. Like an idiot, I tried to tell them the truth. The truth being that Zach was dead in a cave, and someone pretending to be him killed his family. Of course, the sheriff had me show him the cave, so we drove to the cabin and hiked into the woods to find it. Now, here's the part of the story I can't understand. When we got to the clearing, the stone monoliths, the entrance to the cave, they weren't there, like they had just been picked up and carried away. The rope into the cave laid in the tall grass, with the end of it buried into the ground. I can't really blame him, but the sheriff took me in for questioning at that point. Held me for 2 days before they let me go. To this day, I'm pretty certain that I had become their number one suspect. They just didn't have anything to actually tie me to the murders. The rest of the town caught on pretty quickly and avoided me as much as possible. I became the town pariah overnight and had no option but to leave. Turns out no one wants to employ the suspected murderer. Big shock. But that was fine by me. I didn't enjoy staying at the cabin anymore after everything that had happened. I was pretty certain that the thing that had come from the cave had left the woods, but that's actually not as comforting of a thought as you would think. If whatever that thing is can disappear without a trace, maybe it can appear whenever and wherever it wants. Sometimes at night I have nightmares about being back at Zach's house and seeing that evil grin in the corner, and it says to me, the day has come. I wake up in my room and see that the entrance of the cave has opened up in my bedroom floor. A dark, clawed hand reaches up, and then I actually wake up from the nightmare. I can't know for sure if it ever will show up again because honestly, I don't understand what I experienced. At this point, my only option is to move on with my life. What else can I do? All I can do is try to do something other than telling this story over and over again. So you, my friend, will be the last soul that I tell. And if one day I do disappear, you'll know that that thing from the cave kept its promise. Ghastly here. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed it. I purposely wait until the end to ask this because I hate YouTubers that are always asking for likes and subscribes, but it's just one of those things that you have to do. So, if you could do me a big favor, like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. I love hearing from you guys. Until next time, take care.